Welcome back, everybody. In our last video we completed the construction of the two sleeves, the cuffs, the length of the sleeve, and then we have them on stitch holders here. They're both completed, ready to go, and we'll work those back in later on. They'll come back into play for us. But for now we're going to set these aside, and we are going to begin the construction of the body of the sweater. Now we're going to use our size 7 needles again, because we're going to start with some ribbing at the bottom. So the ribbing is going to match the ribbing that we did on the sleeves earlier. So we'll use our size 7 needles and we'll start casting on our stitches. Now according to the pattern, if you are doing the size small, like I am, then you will start by casting on 20 stitches. And then here's where your stitch markers are going to come in handy. You'll place a marker, then you'll cast on 34 stitches, place a marker, then 78 stitches, place a marker, another 34 stitches, and place a marker, and then your final 20 stitches. And what this does is it separates out the different parts of your sweater. This entire body is knitted flat in one piece. We use the circular needle in order to accommodate all of these stitches, but it's basically a one flat piece. And what this will be is the first 20 stitches will be the front flap where your buttonholes go. The next 34 are going to be your right front of your sweater, and then the middle section here will be the back, then the left front, and then the flap on the front where the buttons are attached to. So what I have done here is I've already cast on my stitches and began knitting, and I've taken us up to row 12, which is where it starts getting a little tricky. You'll start out, the first 20 stitches are knit in stockinette, then you do one by one ribbing for the rest of it until you get to your last 20 stitches, and then they are stockinette as well. And those pieces are going to be folded over to make your front flaps on the front. Okay, so what I've done is I've completed that stockinette and ribbing up through row 12, or to row 12, which is where you're going to put your first buttonhole in. And this is where it may get a little tricky for some people, is adding this buttonhole. What the instructions tell you to do is on your wrong side row, which would be row number 12 on the wrong side, you will knit your first 5 stitches, drop your yarn, add in a second ball of yarn, and knit 10 stitches, drop that ball of yarn, pick up a third ball of yarn, and knit, or I guess it would be purl on this side, your last 5 stitches. And then on through the body of the sweater, then you come back on the right side, and when you get to this point, you will knit your first 5 stitches, drop that yarn, pick up the second ball that you had originally joined, knit your middle section of stitches, the 10 stitches, drop that, pick up the third, or the original first ball that you were using, and knit those 5 stitches, and then cut the yarn for all of these. That'll be the width of the buttonhole. It's a 3-row buttonhole. Then, once you're done with that and you come back to the next side, you will just knit straight across all of those and close up the top of the buttonhole. This makes a really nice looking buttonhole, and I'll show you here on one that I've already done. This makes a vertical buttonhole on the front, and when you fold the flap over, what it essentially does is it makes 2 slits wherever the yarn is dropped and started with a new ball. There'll be a slit here, a middle section, and then a slit here. And when you fold those over, those slits will line up, you'll sew it together, and you'll have a buttonhole that goes the entire length through. Really nice buttonhole. It looks really good on the finished sweater. It's nice and sturdy, secure to put your buttons through. And as I said, I've used it on this original one that I first did. As I was knitting this one though, I realized I was going to run into a little snag here. I am using self-striping yarn, and I want my striping to continue in the same pattern that it is going. So if I did my buttonholes and dropped a ball of yarn and added a new one, in order to continue that same striping, I'd have to make sure that my colorway in my yarn was at the exact same spot that I had dropped the last one, and then picked up the third one, have to have it in the same spot there too. That's a lot of hassle, and I'm going to end up wasting a lot of yarn that way. Or my other option was I could just knit to where I should start the buttonhole, cut the yarn, then join again, do the section here, cut the yarn again, then do the last section. The problem with that is I'm going to end up with about 8 different ends around each buttonhole that I have to sew in. I hate sewing in ends. So what I'm going to show you guys is a different buttonhole. You can by all means do the one in the pattern, it looks fantastic, but I'm going to show you a different option here that you can do. This buttonhole that I'm going to do is actually going to be a horizontal buttonhole that will be horizontally on this, and it's not going to be as tall, of course. It'll be this direction, so I'm going to do a certain amount of stitches. Now to figure out how many stitches I have to do, let's work it out here on some paper. What I have is a flap in the front that is essentially 20 stitches. Okay? I'm going to have to put 2 slits for the buttonhole in here because this piece is going to be folded in half to make your front flap. So if I divided this in half, that's 10 stitches on each side. Okay? I want to put the buttonhole basically in the middle of each of these. So I will have a number of stitches on this side, a number of stitches for the buttonhole, and a number of stitches on this side. And the same here. These are going to mirror each other since they'll be folded in half. Since I have 10 stitches, I want my buttonhole to be about 4 stitches in width. So if I make this 4, the buttonhole section 4, that means I will have 3 stitches on either side to get me 6 stitches, 4 for the buttonhole, which is a 10 stitches for the section, or 20 overall. Okay, so let me show you how I'm going to do this buttonhole. It's extremely easy. Since my buttonhole is not as tall, her buttonholes in her pattern are 3 rows tall. Mine is only going to be 1 row tall, so I'm actually not starting it on row 12. I'm moving up to row 13 to place it kind of in the middle of where her buttonhole would have fallen in the original pattern. So mine is actually going to start on the right side, which is row 13. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to knit my first 3 stitches. To get my first part, those first 3. The next 4 are going to be the stitches that encompass the buttonhole. So I'm actually going to bind these stitches off. So I'll knit my first 2 stitches of that, then pass over. If I can grab a hold of it here. Pass that first stitch over, so there's 1 stitch bound off. Knit the next one. Pass the previous one over. There's 2 stitches bound off. Knit the next one. There's 3 stitches bound off. Next one, and then pass the 4th stitch over. So there's 4 bound off stitches. Then I'm going to go ahead and just continue knitting. So I've got 3 stitches, 4 bound off. Then I have, remember in the little diagram I made here, I've got 2 sections of 3, so I need to have 6 stitches before I get to the next bind off of buttonholes. So there's 3 stitches, the 4 bound off. There's 2 stitches already knitted. So there's 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay. So that should leave me before my next section. I should have the final 3 and the 4 that I'm going to bind off, which is what I have here. So these next 4 stitches are going to get bound off. So I'm going to knit the first 2. And then, oops. This fuzzy yarn makes it so hard to pick these up. Okay, there's 1 bound off. There's 2. There's 3. And there's our 4th one. And we'll just go ahead and finish knitting to our marker here. These last 2 stitches. And we see here I have the 3 stitches, the bind off area, the 6 in the middle, the next bind off area, and then the last 3 stitches. And when this is folded over, those 2 holes will line up and we'll have a nice horizontal buttonhole. Now I'm going to go ahead and continue in the pattern for the rest of this, the length of the sweater here, and then I'll come back on the wrong side and I'll show you what to do when we get back to these buttonholes again. So I'll meet you right back here in a second. Okay, so I have finished knitting across and then back again, and I've stopped here right next to where we bound off our 4 stitches for our first buttonhole area. Okay, so what do we do? Well, there are no stitches here to knit to continue knitting across. So what do we have to do? We have to cast on some stitches, and I'm going to show you what they call the twisted or backwards loop cast on method to add 4 stitches on here to close up this side of the buttonhole. So in order to do this, what I do is I take my working yarn in my left hand, I kind of wrap it around my 2 fingers, take my needle and catch the yarn here in the front, if you can see that or not, and then just slide it on and tighten it up. I'll do that again. Grab the yarn, twist it around my fingers, catch the yarn with the needle, tighten it up. And we're going to cast on 4 stitches that way. So there's my 3rd one. Oops. And there is my 4th one. And then we will continue purling. Oops, let me get my yarn in the front here. Purl our next 6 stitches that were in the middle. And once again, we are to our next buttonhole, so we have to cast on 4 stitches here again. So we're going to do the same thing. Twist the yarn around our fingers, catch it, tighten it up. Oops. Twist it around my fingers, catch the front, tighten it up. That's 3, and then this one is 4. Okay. And then we will purl our last 3 stitches here. So what happens is, now that we have cast those stitches on the other side of the button, when we go to knit back, mess all entangled here. When we go to knit back, we will just knit those stitches that we cast on, and it'll close up that side of our buttonhole. So let's do that here. We're going to just knit straight across them. And they may seem a little loose. You see here, there's kind of a loose area here. That's fine though, because once we fold our flap over and connect those buttonholes together, we're going to sew all around them, and it's going to tighten up those edges so you won't see any of those holes there. I'm just going to continue knitting here. Close up our buttonholes. And as you can see here, and knit across that so we have a horizontal buttonhole. Pretty nifty, huh? And we'll have 2 of those once I complete this, and then we'll be able to fold them over, sew them together, and we'll have a buttonhole that goes straight through the flap. Now these buttonholes, whether you're doing the one that I just showed you or the one that is in the pattern, are going to come up periodically through the pattern. We see this was the first one that we just completed, and if you're doing the ones from her pattern, it'll take place across 3 different rows. Starts at row 12, ends at row 14, and then you close it up on row 15. That's just by knitting across. They come up throughout the pattern, and she has them, if you've printed this in color, she has them highlighted in red to show you where they show up. The ones with an S beside it are where you start the small. It'll say an M if that's where you work on the medium ones, and the L for the large throughout the pattern. The tricky part about this is just remembering to do it. However, as I said, she has them highlighted in red for you, so you know where to put those buttonholes as we come through here. So what we're going to continue doing now is we will continue finishing up our ribbing. We go through 24 rows of ribbing on this. Then we're going to switch to our size 8 needles and do 4 rows of stockinette. And then we'll come to our next tricky part, which is adding in the pockets. So I'm going to continue doing this, and I'll meet you back here to start row 29, where we add our first pocket. Okay, so we are to our next tricky part of this pattern, and that is adding in our first pocket. And let me show you what I have done so far. I have completed the 1x1 ribbing section. I've switched to my size 8 needles and completed 4 rows of stockinette. And if you're following the pattern, it should end you up on a wrong side row, so that our next row, row number 29, is a right side row. And this is where we're going to add our pocket. Now we're going to knit our first 20 stitches of the front flap, which I've already done here. And then to add the pocket, you're going to need your scrap yarn and blunt needle ready to make another little stitch holder. Now what the pattern tells you to do is for the next 23 stitches of this next section, we're going to knit into the front and back of each of these stitches, which is basically going to make 2 stitches out of each one of these. Now it doesn't use the entire front. Remember, this front is 34 stitches wide, so you're only going to use the first 23. The other 11 we'll worry about here in a little bit. So I've already done the first stitch where I've knit into the front and back, and from that one stitch you can see I have 2 stitches here. The second stitch that we make each time we knit into the front and back, we're going to slip onto our scrap yarn stitch holder. And I find it easier to do it from the right side. So what I'm going to do is just find that stitch there, slide it onto my yarn, and then move that stitch off the needle and just let it hang out back there on that yarn. You don't want to tighten it up too much because it'll make it a little harder later on when we go to pick it back up to knit it. And I also suggest your scrap yarn that you're using be at least the same weight as the yarn that you're using to knit the sweater. If you use anything thinner, then it's going to tighten around that thin yarn, and it'll make it hard for you to pick it up. So let's continue. I'll show you here. I'm going to knit into the front like I normally do. You don't slide the stitch off, you go ahead and stick it into the back and knit it again and make 2 stitches out of that one stitch. And then go ahead and slide it off. And then before we knit our next one, we're going to take our needle and slide that second stitch we made, trying to be careful not to split the yarn because that'll make it difficult later on. Slide that onto that stitch, or onto that yarn, and then slide it off. Let's do one more. Knit into the front of it like we normally would. Slide around. Oops, knit into the back of it here. Slide it off, and then take our yarn, slide that stitch off. Let's do another because I'm not sure if I was actually in frame when I was doing those other ones, so let's do our next one here. Looks like I've got a little what you didn't see was that I had actually done this and then I came back and took it all back out again so I could show it to you. So I actually picked up a little extra yarn there. So I'm going to knit, then knit into the back, slide it off, pick up my needle, and take that stitch off. And you see here these stitches that we have slid onto the scrap yarn, they're just going to hang out in the back here, and we will deal with those later on. So I'm going to go ahead and continue doing this for the 23 stitches, and then I'll meet you back here in a second to show you what our next step is. Okay, so here are our 23 newly made stitches on our scrap yarn, and what I do is just take the ends of my scrap yarn and just tie a little square knot here. At the end to keep it from going anywhere. Okay, now to make our pocket, instead of continuing to knit through the rest of the sweater, we'll get to that in a little bit, but for now we're going to leave the rest of this alone. We're going to stop here and turn our work. And the 23 stitches that we had on our needle, we're going to ignore the ones we have on the stitch holder for now, and we're just going to concentrate on these ones that we have on our needle. And what we're going to do is purl back across those 23 stitches and the 20 at the beginning. So we're going to purl 43. Okay, and then we will knit back and actually start a decrease, and then purl back, knit back, and then will be time for our buttonhole again. So I'm going to purl these, and then I'll join you back here when we get to the decrease and show you how to do that portion of it. So I'll meet you back here in just a second. Okay, so I have purled back the 43 stitches. On our next row, which is row 31, we are going to knit our first 20, and then we're only going to knit 21 of those 23 stitches that we have for the pocket. And our last two, we're just going to knit those two together. So you're just going to stick your needle through both of those stitches, oops, as if to knit. And then grab the right yarn here, and then just knit them off. And that reduces it by 1. What you're going to be doing is reducing every so many rows, and it's going to give a nice slant to the edge of the pocket. So it's a nice little area for you to stick your hand in. So once we've done that, we will turn our work again, and we're going to just purl back across all these stitches, which is now 42 instead of 43 because we've decreased one here. Okay, now once you've purled back, you're going to knit back again all 42 with no decrease this next time, and that will put you to row 34. Now if you're doing the buttonholes from the pattern, you will put your next buttonhole in at that time when you get to that section. So you'll purl the 42 and then put your buttonholes in on the wrong side. If you're doing these horizontal buttonholes that I showed you, you're going to skip the buttonhole on row 34 and you're going to put those in on row 35, the way I showed you earlier in the video. But this will just continue this way. You're gonna knit, purl where it tells you, decrease where it tells you, put the buttonhole in where it tells you, until you have completed up through row 58. So I'm gonna work on this, and I will meet you guys back here at row 58 to show you how we finish off the top part of the pocket. So when you're finished with row 58, you should have something that looks like this. It looks a little funny, probably doesn't look anything like a hooded cardigan, but trust me, if you stick with the pattern, it'll all work out in the end and it looks fantastic. But this is what you should have. You should have your ribbing section here at the bottom. You should have 2 sets of buttonholes, and then this flap, which is going to eventually be the front of the pocket. Okay, now I have finished purling row 58. I have cut my yarn, as the instructions say to do, and now I'm going to slide these stitches, all 37 of them, the 20 for the front flap and then the 17 that you have left from the pocket after you've decreased, onto another stitch holder here, and then we will put these aside and deal with them later. So let's get all of them off of here. If I have a big enough piece of scrap yarn. And once again, remember, try not to split the yarn, because that's going to make it difficult to pull the scrap yarn out later on if you've got it woven through an actual strand of yarn. So here's our last 17 stitches here from the pocket front. Pretty simple. Now, once I get all these off of here, I will just tie a knot in the 2 ends of the scrap yarn here, just to keep this set of stitches from going anywhere. Okay. And now we're going to continue working on with the rest of the stitches that we have on here until we get to our next pocket front, and then we're basically going to do the same thing. We're going to knit to the front and back, take those stitches that we make and put them on a stitch holder, and then knit back and forth until we get the front side like this, but it'll be over here. And then once we do that, we'll put those on stitch markers and then pick up stitches again to knit the back of the pockets. So I'm going to go ahead and start. If you look at our pattern here, at the bottom it says we're going to return to left pocket row 29, which is basically where we left off. We did 28 rows and then we started with 29 to start picking up our extra stitches for the pocket. Well, we left off with row 29 here. This is row 29, so we're going to start with row 29, going back from row 58 to row 29 again. And we're going to knit these 11 stitches, plus all the rest of these, and then we will stop when we get to our last 23 stitches, plus the 20 for the side here, and we'll start knitting into the front and back. So I'm going to knit over to that point and get our stitches on the stitch holder, and then I'll show you the next little tricky bit with this. Okay, so here's where we are now. What I have done is I have knitted across, I have done my knit into the front and back, placed my made stitches on my scrap yarn, then completed the row, and then I have purled back across the 43 stitches. Okay. Now that brings us to row 31, which is going to be our first decrease for this side. Now the decreases are going to be on a different side because this is the left front, so the pocket opening is going to be on this side instead of this side like it was previously. So we're going to put our decreases here, which means instead of knitting two together, we're going to do a slip slip knit, which is very simple. You just slip 2 stitches as if to knit, put your left needle back into them, and then knit them through the back loop. Simple as that. So you're going to slip slip knit the first one on row 31 and then knit the rest of the stitches across. So that will be your types of decrease on this side. There will be those, and there will be some purling two togethers like there was on the other side as well. So that's pretty simple. You've already done the one side. You're kind of familiar with how this side is going to work, so I'm going to leave you to it. Work on that, and I will meet you back here when you finish row 58 of this side, and I'll show you how we're going to join all these pockets together. So here is what we've got. You have your middle rib section, a flap on the right side, and a flap on the left side. And these are going to become the fronts of the pockets. Now, our pattern has us returning to row 29, because what we're going to do now is pick up the stitches from the back of the pocket that we had before, connect into the ribbing here, and then knit up to row 59 to catch us up to where we left off with the top of the pockets. And then we'll join all this together, and you'll have basically a pocket, a little hole to put your hand in. And then all you'll have to do when the pocket is finished, just sew up the inside of the pocket here to close up the inside. That's it for the pocket. So what we're going to do, and I've already started here, is pick up those 23 stitches that you have on your stitch marker. Now, the pattern has you starting on the wrong side, so flip it over to the wrong side. You'll take your needle and pick up this first set of 23 stitches that we have here on our scrap piece of yarn. And it's pretty simple. You just basically take your needle and stick it through the loop of that stitch. Now some of these might be a little tight and you gotta pull them out there a little bit to kind of make sure you have room to get your needle in. And we should have 23 stitches, so let me count and make sure. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 22, 23. There's our 23 stitches. So now all I have to do is get a pair of scissors, and I'm going to cut that scrap yarn and then simply just pull it out. And now I have my 23 stitches back on my needle with all the rest of them. And all we're going to do is just join our yarn back in and purl back across. And for the rest of these rows, the other, was it 31 rows we're going to do here, we're just going to do stockinette stitch. Knit on the right side, purl on the wrong side. Now we're starting on the wrong side here, so we're going to purl all these. When we get over to this side, then we will have to take our needle and pick up our stitches here from this stitch holder as well, and that'll finish out our row. Once we've picked those up and we've purled them, then we'll just continue knitting back across, knit and purl, until we reach the same length as the top of the pockets. So I'm going to do that, and I will meet you guys back here at row 59 once again at the top of the pockets, and I'll show you what to do then. Alright, so here's what we have. I finished with row 58, and we have the back piece now of the pocket is, or should be, the same length as the front of the pocket. So now we got to join these two parts together. Now I am actually going to cut my yarn. The instructions don't say to, but I don't really know how you would do the next part without cutting the yarn. Plus I'm at the end of my ball of yarn anyway, so I'm just going to cut and leave enough to weave in later on. And now we're going to return to our stitches we have on the stitch holder here in the front. And our instructions tell us to slip them onto a size 8 double pointed needle. Well, I don't have a double pointed needle, so I'm going to use my size 7 needle just on another cable that I have. And we need to put these back onto a needle because we are going to start working them again. And we're going to join them to the ones that we have in the back. So I need to pick them up. And in order to do this, I'm going to do it from left to right because I want the end of my needle to end up over here on the side facing the same direction as my back needle. Because we're going to do basically, it's kind of like a 3-needle bind off. We're not binding anything off, we'll just be knitting them together. And you'll see it as we go through. So I'm going to start picking these up from the left side here. And we should have 37 stitches. I gotta make sure I get all 37 stitches back on this needle. And remember, as we're doing this, we go carefully, trying not to split the yarn. Just picking up that one stitch. And if we didn't pull these too tightly, it should be pretty easy to do. Although sometimes even if you leave them a little loose, they get pulled tight as you're working your other stitches. Almost there. We're on our last 20 stitches from the front of the button flap in the front. Hopefully, I will count when we get to the end here, and hopefully I've picked up all 37 stitches. Alright, let's count, make sure. There's 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 22, 24, 26, 28, 30, 32, 34, 36, 37. All 37 stitches. Now, I'm going to cut my scrap yarn here, pull it out, and there I have my stitches back on the needle to work. So, there we go. I'm going to join in another ball of yarn here. Oops, I lost some stitches off of that needle. Actually, my stitches slipped off and I lost some stitches, so I'm going to put them back on my other needle and purl them again. Which will take just a second here. Okay, so we've got our back stitches, our front stitches, and a new ball of yarn. Now, Remember, our first 20 stitches of this row are from the button flap in the front. So we're just going to knit those just regularly. We're not going to join them with anything else because there's nothing to join them to. So I just need to knit my first 20 here. Join in my fuzzy yarn here. When I join in a new ball of yarn, I kind of like to hold both the working yarn and the tail end together and knit with both of them for the first couple of stitches, just to make sure that it secures in place and doesn't slide anywhere. So I'm going to go and continue knitting my 20 stitches here, which will be over to our marker. Almost there. Alright, now we're going to join our stitches together. So I hold the stitches in the front and the stitches in the back, and I'm going to put my needle through the front one as if to knit, and then through the back stitch as well, and knit those two together, pull them off the needle. Again, through the front one, through the back one, knit those two stitches together, pull them off the needle. And be careful when you're pulling them off the needle that you don't pull extra stitches off there. I almost did that just a second ago. So basically you're just knitting two stitches together, one from the front needle, one from the back needle each time, and then pulling them off until you have all 17 stitches worked together here. And go slow, make sure that you're getting it through both of those at the same time. Oop, like there, I slipped off. Did it again. Trying to move too quickly here, and I'm getting kind of sloppy. There we go. So just through the front one, through the back one, and then knit through both of them. Slide them off the needle. And if you're not using really fuzzy yarn like I am, it should go a lot easier than this. I'm having some difficulty with some of these little fuzzy areas. Okay, just a couple more stitches here. 4 to be exact. And there's our last joint stitches. And there you have it. Your pocket is now joined. You see on the other side here, of course, that's the inside of your pocket. You'll sew that to the body of the sweater once we do our finishing work later on to close up the pocket, but there's your pocket. It's pretty simple. So, all you do now is just continue on across the row. When we get to our other pocket area on this side, we'll do the same thing. We'll pick these stitches back up, join the first 17 of them together, knit the final 20, and that will be the basic part of our body of our sweater. After that, it's just knitting and purling back and forth until you get to the area where we will join the sleeves in, which will be at row number 100 is where we'll start working on the sleeves. So continue with that, and I'll join you guys back here for row 100, and we'll start adding in our sleeves.